Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was chosen by the Anti-Monitor to destroy the hero world. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The city of Musitifa smelled of wet ash and ozone. It was a constant, cloying scent that clung to the back of the throat, a funereal perfume for a society on its deathbed. Weeks had passed since the Paranormal Liberation War had ripped the heart out of Hero Society, but the wounds were not healing. They were festering. Trust had evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind a hard, cynical sediment. The great symbols had fallen, and in their place, 1,000 petty tyrants and desperate scavengers had risen from the cracks. And through it all, Izuku Midoriya moved like a phantom. He was a blur of ragged green and tarnished silver, a living embodiment of perpetual motion. Sleep was a luxury he hadn't afforded himself in what felt like a lifetime. Food was whatever he could cram into his mouth between skirmishes, usually stale protein bars scavenged from abandoned convenience stores. His costume, once a vibrant tribute to his mentor, was now a tattered chronicle of his crusade. The fabric was torn, scorched, and stained with things he refused to identify. The metal plates of his gauntlets were dented and scraped, the shoot-style insignia on his salves worn almost smooth. Right now, he was perched atop a skeletal ruin of a skyscraper, the wind whipping his torn cape around him like a shroud. Below, the streetlights cast long, predatory shadows. The city was a wounded beast, and he was its last, exhausted antibody. Ninth, you need to rest. The voice was Nana Shimura's, a gentle but firm presence within the symphony of souls that was one for all. It was a familiar refrain, one he had been ignoring for days. Can't, Izuku mumbled, his voice a raw rasp. He scanned the streets below, his eyes, bruised with fatigue, missing nothing. They don't rest. Pushing yourself to the point of collapse will not save anyone, Daigoro Banjo, the fifth, chimed in, his tone gruff but laced with concern. You're a kid, not a damn generator. He ignored them. He had to. To listen was to acknowledge the impossible weight on his shoulders, and to acknowledge it was to be crushed by it. He was the pillar now. All might had crumbled, the foundations of Hero Society had been pulverized, and he, Izuku Midoriya, was the only thing left holding up the sky. And the sky was so heavy. Danger Sense, his newest and most taxing quirk, was a low, incessant hum at the base of his skull. It hadn't stopped humming in weeks. It was a constant feed of the city's pain, a mugging 3 blocks east, a building fire sparked by a turf war to the north, a cry for help swallowed by the indifferent night to the west. It was an endless, overwhelming tide of suffering, and he was trying to hold it back with his bare hands. He pushed off the ledge, the green lightning of one for all crackling around him with a weary energy. He didn't soar anymore. He fell with purpose, using air force to cushion his landing in a back alley reeking of garbage and despair. He landed without a sound, a testament to the brutal efficiency his solo war had taught him. His target was a small group of looters, empowered by newly manifested, unstable quirks. They had cornered a shopkeeper who dared to defend his meager inventory of canned goods. One of the looters had hands that dripped a viscous, corrosive acid. Another's skin could harden into a jagged, crystalline shell. They weren't villains in the grand sense. They weren't Shigaraki or All for One. They were just hungry, scared people who had chosen to inflict their fear on others. They were a symptom of the disease he was trying to cure. He didn't denounce himself. There was no time for heroic monologues. He moved. Black Whip shot out, silent and black as ink, ensnaring the acid user's arms and yanking him off his feet. Before the man even hit the ground, Izuku was already on the second, his body a green bolt of lightning. A 5% Delaware smash was enough to send a shockwave of air that knocked the crystal-skinned man into a brick wall, his defensive quirk shattering like cheap glass. The third, who could only manage a pathetic flicker of flame from his fingertips, simply froze, his eyes wide with the terror of seeing a legend, or a monster, materialize from the shadows. Izuku tied them up with a combination of his capture weapon and discarded electrical wiring. He didn't speak to them. He didn't lecture them. He just neutralized the threat, his movements economical and devoid of any flourish. He retrieved the scattered cans for the grateful, weeping shopkeeper, accepted a choked, "Thank you," with a curt nod, and then he was gone, melting back into the urban labyrinth. As he propelled himself through the concrete canyons, the vestiges were quiet. They had seen this 100 times. They felt his exhaustion, his growing numbness. The bright-eyed boy who had cried with joy upon receiving this power was being eroded, ground down by the sheer, unending friction of reality. It's not enough, Izuku thought, the idea a cold, smooth stone in his gut. I stop this one crime, and 10 more spring up. I save one person, and 100 more are in danger. It's a leak in a dam, and I'm trying to plug it with my fingers, but the whole structure is rotten. He was heading towards a provisional shelter set up in a fortified high school gymnasium. He'd heard rumors of a coordinated attack by a larger gang hoping to seize the shelter's medical supplies. It was a long shot, but he had to be there. He had to be everywhere. The rain started then. A cold, miserable drizzle that promised to turn into a downpour. It slicked the streets, making the city gleam with a false beauty, like a polished tombstone. The water plastered his matted green hair to his forehead and stung the cuts on his face. It was on his way there, cutting through a ravaged commercial district. That danger sense didn't just hum. It screamed. It was a sharp, piercing shriek of imminent, catastrophic peril that dwarfed the background noise of the city's pain. It was so intense it made his teeth ache. He changed direction instantly, a green comet streaking towards the source. He arrived to a scene of pure chaos. It was a collapsed overpass, the massive concrete slabs lying like broken bones across the street below. The cause was immediately apparent, a battle. On one side, 2 figures who looked like they'd clawed their way out of a post-apocalyptic nightmare. One was a hulking brute whose body was a grotesque patchwork of scrap metal and flesh, his quirk seemingly allowing him to fuse metal to his own body. The other was a lithe woman whose limbs could stretch and contort like rubber, whipping around with lethal speed. They were fighting 2 pro-heroes Izuku barely recognized, B-listers at best, their costumes grimy, and their faces etched with frantic fear. They were outmatched, but they weren't the source of the danger sense spike. Trapped between the warring factions, pinned in the wreckage of a crushed minivan, was a family. A father, his arm clearly broken, was trying to shield his wife and 2 small children. The minivan's frame had buckled around them, a metal cage that had become a trap. A heavy slab of concrete teetered precariously on the wreckage above them, groaning under its own weight, threatening to crush them all. Izuku's world narrowed. The heroes, the villains, they were secondary. The family was the focal point. "I've got the family!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the din. The 2 pro-heroes looked at him with a surge of desperate hope. He powered up One for All to 45%, the familiar strain groaning through his bones. Black whip erupted from his body, not as single tendrils, but as a thick net of black energy, weaving itself under the slab of concrete. He gritted his teeth, muscles screaming in protest as he took the immense weight. The concrete stopped shifting. "Get them out of there! Now!" he roared at the heroes. But the villains weren't going to wait. The scrap metal brute saw Izuku as the bigger threat and charged, his footsteps shaking the ground. "The ghost! His head will be worth a fortune!" The lithe woman's arm stretched, becoming a hardened spear aimed directly at the trapped family. A split-second calculation. A horrifying, impossible choice. He was holding up the concrete slab. If he moved, they were crushed. If he didn't, the woman's attack would impale them. The 2 pro-heroes were already engaged with the metal brute, a desperate, losing battle. There was only one option. He had to do both. "F.A. Jean!" he yelled, releasing the kinetic energy stored in his muscles. The surge of power flowed into Black Whip, giving him a precious half-second of stability. In that instant, he used his free hand, flicking his fingers. A compressed ball of air, a St. Louis smash, shot out and clipped the woman's extended arm, knocking it off course. It punched through the wall of a nearby building instead of the family, but the redirection of energy had cost him. His focus on Black Whip wavered. The concrete slab groaned, slipping a few inches. A child screamed, "Focus, Izuku!" The voice of the second user was sharp, a drill sergeant's bark in his mind. He poured more of himself into One for All, the green energy flaring so brightly it hurt to look at. He was holding. The father had managed to pull his wife and their older son, a boy of about 10, from the wreckage. They scrambled away, looking back with terrified eyes. Only the younger child, a little girl no older than 6 with wide, frightened eyes and a bright yellow raincoat, was still stuck, her leg pinned by a piece of twisted metal. "My daughter! Her leg is caught!" the mother shrieked. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. He could see it. The metal was bent around her tiny ankle. He couldn't just pull her out. The scrap metal villain, having thrown one of the pro-heroes aside like a doll, was charging again. The elastic woman, recovering, was preparing another strike. There was no time. No good options. Only terrible ones. He made a decision. He adjusted the angle of Black Whip, trying to shift the concrete slab's center of gravity just enough to pin it against the ruin of a lamppost. It was a gamble of physics, and sheer power that would buy him maybe 2 seconds. "Get ready, Tio, run!" he screamed at the father. He let the slab shift. It scraped against the metal pole with a sound like the world tearing in half. In that 2-second window, he propelled himself forward, a green flash of light. He landed by the minivan, his hands reaching for the twisted metal around the girl's leg. It was thicker than he thought. He pulled, his gauntlets groaning, the metal screeching in protest. He felt it give. The girl was free. "Go!" he urged, pushing her towards her father. But the world is governed by cruel rules. The rule of momentum. The rule of gravity. The scrap metal villain, in his blind charge, had slammed into the lamppost. The pole, already damaged, buckled. Izuku's 2-second window vanished. The concrete slab, its precarious perch gone, fell. He saw it in horrifying slow motion. The girl in the yellow raincoat, stumbling towards her family. Her father's outstretched hand. Her mother's scream. He wasn't fast enough. He was right there, but he wasn't fast enough. He threw himself forward, pushing the girl. He managed to shove her tiny body most of the way out of the impact zone. Most of the way. The slab came down with a final, earth-shattering crunch. Silence. A profound, absolute silence that swallowed every other sound in the city. The rain seemed to fall without noise. The villains froze. The heroes froze. Izuku pushed himself up. His body ached. Blood trickled from his hairline. He looked at the family. The father was holding his daughter. The mother was on her knees, her face a mask of disbelief. The little girl was limp in her father's arms. Her yellow raincoat was pristine, but from beneath the edge of the concrete slab, a small, sneaker-clad foot and a portion of her leg were visible, crushed and unnaturally still. She hadn't been fully caught. But a falling mountain doesn't need to land squarely to kill a butterfly. The shockwave, the shrapnel of concrete, the brutal impact just inches away, it had been enough. The father looked at Izuku. There was no anger in his eyes. No blame. There was just a hollow, bottomless abyss of grief. It was a look that flayed Izuku's soul more effectively than any villain's attack ever could. He had saved them. And he had failed them completely. He stood there, paralyzed, as the surviving pro-hero finally managed to subdue the stunned villains. He didn't hear the sirens that began to wail in the distance. He didn't feel the cold rain that was now a torrential downpour, soaking him to the bone. All he could see was a small, still shape in a yellow raincoat and the vacant, shattered eyes of her parents. He had given everything. He had pushed his body and spirit to their absolute limits. He had wielded the world's greatest power. And the result was this. This quiet, obscene tragedy. This monument to his inadequacy. The pillar holding up the sky didn't just crack. It turned to dust. He fled. He didn't know where he was going. He just ran, a streak of green misery, leaving the scene behind. He couldn't face them. He couldn't face the proof of his failure. The voices of the vestiges were a frantic chorus in his head, trying to comfort, to reason, to rally him, but he couldn't hear their words. They were just noise, drowned out by the roaring silence of his own despair. He finally collapsed in a narrow, forgotten alleyway, wedged between a pawn shop with a shattered window and a noodle bar that would never open again. He slid down the wet brick wall, his body finally giving out. He sat there in the filth and the rain, his head in his hands, shuddering with silent, racking sobs. It's not enough. It will never be enough. The thought was no longer a stone in his gut. It was his entire reality. The cycle was endless. Heroes rise, villains rise to meet them. Power is used to save, and power is used to destroy. Quirks, the very foundation of their society, were a catalyst for both miracles and atrocities. For every life he saved, another was endangered by the very conflict he was perpetuating. He wasn't a solution, he was just a participant in a fundamentally broken equation. All for One wasn't the disease, he was a symptom. Shigaraki wasn't the poison, he was a reaction. The disease, the poison, was the system itself, the endless struggle. The very concept of power. 9th. Izuku, please. This is not your fault. You can't save everyone. Nana's voice was pleading, desperate. Then what's the point? Izuku whispered to the rain. What is the point of all this power if it just leads to more pain? If the best I can do is choose who suffers less? That little girl, she's dead because heroes and villains were fighting. She's dead because quirks exist. The whole world is sick. And I'm just fighting the fever, but the infection is in the bones. His despair was a physical thing, a cold, heavy presence in the alley with him. It was so total, so absolute, that it seemed to warp the very air around him. The rain fell, the city wept, and Izuku Midoriya, the 9th holder of One for All, the world's last great hope, gave up. And in that perfect vacuum of hope, something answered. It was not a voice. It was not a sound. It was a thought that was not his own, sliding into his mind as smoothly and coldly as a shard of ice into a vein. It was ancient, vast, and utterly, terrifyingly calm. You are right. Izuku flinched, looking around the empty alley. The thought was pristine, without emotion, like a mathematical proof. The design is flawed. The equation is imbalanced. You see the cycle. The endless, grinding friction of existence. Creation and destruction, locked in a meaningless, painful dance. You see it because a part of you is already beyond it. Who is this? Yoichi Shigaraki's essence flared within him, a spark of pure terror. 9th, block it out. This is wrong, but Izuku was too broken to resist. The strange, silent voice was not attacking him. It was agreeing with him. It was validating the terrible truth he had just discovered. What are you? Izuku breathed, his own voice sounding small and childish. I am the resolution. I am the silence at the end of the story. You call this existence? This cacophony of pain, this brief flicker of light between two eternities of darkness? It is a failed experiment, one of many. A universe that dreams, and in doing so, creates nightmares for itself. The voice felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. From the space between raindrops. From the void between stars. It was a presence so immense it made All for One feel like a petulant child. You desire to save them. A noble, but flawed ambition. You cannot save a flawed creation by participating in its flaws. You cannot heal a diseased body by treating one of its many sores. You must address the source of the infection. Visions flooded Izuku's mind, not forced upon him, but blooming naturally from the entity's words. He saw the history of quirks, a sped-up montage of heroism and horror. He saw the first quirked individual, the radiant baby, and the fear it created. He saw the rise of heroes and the concurrent rise of villains to challenge them. He saw All Might's brightest triumphs, and in their shadow, the countless tragedies that still occurred. He saw his own battles, the lives he'd saved, and now, the face of the little girl in the yellow raincoat, her eyes wide and lifeless. The cycle. The endless, agonizing cycle. The potential for power is the potential for conflict. The potential for conflict is the certainty of suffering. Your goal to save everyone is impossible within the confines of this design, but it is not an impossible goal. You are simply using the wrong method. What other method is there? Izuku asked, tears mixing with the rain on his face. He was clinging to the voice's logic like a drowning man to a rock. Erasure. The word was not spoken. It was felt. A concept of such profound finality that it made the alley feel colder, not destruction. Destruction is chaotic, painful. It leaves ruins and memories. It is part of the cycle. Erasure is peace. The unmaking. The return to the perfect, silent state from which all this noise emerged. Imagine it, child of hope. A world without quirks. A world without the struggle for power. A world without villains, and therefore, without the need for heroes. A world without pain, without fear, without loss. The vision shifted. It was no longer the past. It was a potential future. He saw the city, but it was still. There were no sirens, no explosions, no screams. There were no heroes soaring through the sky, no villains lurking in the shadows. There was just silence. A serene, absolute peace. The peace of a blank page. The peace of a perfectly still pond. The peace of nothingness. There was no suffering because there was nothing left to suffer. It was horrifying. And in his current state, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. No! Izuku, don't listen! Nana Shimura was screaming in his soul, her voice filled with a terror he had never heard from her before. That is the peace of the grave. It is the end of everything. Life is the struggle. Hope is the fight, but her desperate cries were a dying candle in a hurricane. This new presence was a cosmic certainty. She speaks of the cage and calls of freedom, the voice whispered, its calm logic cutting through the vestiges' panic. She clings to the pain because it is all she has ever known. You see the truth. The only way to truly save them from the game is to stop the game from being played. I can give you the power to do that. The power to unmake. The power to bring true, final peace. The power to erase the flaw. A choice was laid before him, clear and simple. He could stand up, grit his teeth, and throw himself back into the endless, losing battle. He could save a few more people today, and watch a few more die tomorrow. He could honor the legacy of One for All, this beautiful, terrible engine of the very cycle he now despised. He could live and die as a hero, leaving behind a world just as broken as he found it. Or, he could accept. He could take this new, awful power and apply a permanent solution. He could become the savior he always wanted to be, not by saving people one by one, but by saving existence itself from its inherent flaw. The cost would be everything, but the reward would be an end to all suffering. An end to failure. An end to little girls in yellow raincoats dying for nothing. He looked at his hands, the scarred, trembling fingers that had failed to pull a child from the path of death. He thought of the father's hollow eyes. His choice was made in the silent depths of his shattered heart. Yes, Izuku whispered, the single word a vow of surrender. Make it stop. Please, just make it all stop. The moment he gave his consent, the universe held its breath. The green lightning of One for All, which had been flickering weakly around him, suddenly flared with violent, desperate intensity. It was a last, defiant roar of life and legacy. The faces of all 8 vestiges appeared in his mind's eye, their features twisted in agony and betrayal as they were consumed. A single point of absolute black appeared on the back of his right gauntlet. It was not a color. It was the absence of color, the absence of light, the absence of information. It was a hole in reality. It did not burn or crackle. It simply grew. Silently, hungrily it expanded, flowing over the green lightning like a tide of black oil over water. The crackling sound of One for All was muted, then silenced, as the antimatter energy consumed it. The warmth of the power he had known his whole life, the feeling of the 8 souls within him, all of it was snuffed out, replaced by a profound, empty coldness. The black energy flowed up his arm, his costume and flesh seeming to phase through it, untouched but fundamentally overwritten. It stopped at his shoulder, sinking into his very being. The last spark of green in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a calm, fathomless darkness. The transformation took only a few seconds. When it was over, Izuku Midoriya pushed himself to his feet. The rain had stopped. The city was quiet. He stood straight, the exhaustion and grief wiped from his features, replaced by a serene, unnerving placidity. He felt no pain, no fatigue, no despair. He felt only a vast, quiet purpose. He looked at his hand. The gauntlet was unchanged, but he could feel the new power thrumming within him. The power of the end. The power of silence. He was no longer the pillar of hope, struggling to hold up a crumbling world. He was the herald of its erasure. He would not save society. He would grant it the mercy of a final, perfect unmaking. He had been meant to save them. And now he would. The return to Uehai was like a ghost visiting its own grave. Izuku walked, he didn't run. There was no need for air force, no urgency to propel him across the rooftops. The city, once a three-dimensional chessboard where he was the most dynamic piece, now felt like a static diorama, a fixed moment of decay he was merely passing through. The anti-monitor's power didn't hum or crackle like One for All. It was a profound and unnerving stillness within him, a patch of absolute zero in the core of his soul. It didn't grant him energy, it granted him perspective, and from this new perspective, Yui was no longer a sanctuary. It was a folly. He approached the main gate, where the state-of-the-art defense systems were on high alert. The massive walls, once a symbol of security and hope, now seemed to him like the walls of a pressure cooker. Inside, fear, desperation, and a fragile, baseless optimism were being contained, building towards an inevitable rupture. The entire structure was a testament to a flawed philosophy. The idea that you could wall off chaos, that you could build a fortress strong enough to keep a broken world at bay. It was, he now understood, fundamentally illogical. The sensors barely registered him. He wasn't emitting a quirk signature, not in any way they could recognize. The vast, cosmic power within him was silent on all known energy spectrums. He simply walked to the guard post, where Cementos and a handful of other pro-heroes stood watch, their faces grim and exhausted. Midoriya, Cementos said, his deep voice heavy with relief. His form seemed to slump slightly. You're back. We were worried. Izuku tilted his head. He could see the molecular imperfections in the hero's concrete skin, the tiny stress fractures forming from constant use and fatigue. He could see the statistical probability of structural failure in the defensive wall behind him. He could see the hope in Cementos's eyes and recognize it for what it was, a temporary chemical reaction in the brain, designed to stave off the logical conclusion of despair. I am fine, Sensei, Izuku replied. His voice was different. The breathless, earnest energy was gone. It was level, calm, and utterly devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a man giving a weather report in the middle of a hurricane. The change was not lost on Cementos. The hero's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you? You look. You need to get to the infirmary. Get some rest. Rest is an inefficient allocation of resources when the core problem remains unsolved, Izuku stated, the thought forming with crystalline clarity in his mind. The anti-monitor's presence was not a voice giving commands. It was a constant, silent affirmation, a cosmic hum that resonated with the nihilistic truths he now perceived. It was the new foundation of his consciousness. Before Cementos could process the unnerving statement, a familiar, chopping motion cut through the air. Midoriya! Your return is a great relief. However, your unauthorized solo activities were a severe breach of protocol. We must report to Principal Nizu at once for a full debriefing and a medical evaluation. Tenya Ida rushed forward, his armor clanking, a whirlwind of earnest procedure. In the past, Izuku would have been flustered, apologetic, maybe even a little inspired by Ida's unwavering commitment to order. Now, he saw his friend and saw only another flawed system. He saw a boy clinging to rules as a shield against a universe that respected none. He saw the frantic energy of the reciprocal burst engines as a desperate attempt to outrun entropy. Ida-kun, Izuku said, his calm gaze meeting his friend's frantic one. Your concern is noted. The flat, dismissive tone stopped Ida cold. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked Izuku up and down, and for the first time, truly saw him. He saw the eyes. They had always been wide, expressive pools of emerald green, burning with emotion. Now they were still, deep, and ancient. They were the eyes of a deep space probe that had seen the birth and death of stars and was no longer impressed by either. Midoriya, are you all right? Ida asked, his voice losing its booming authority and shrinking to a whisper of genuine fear. I have never been more clear, Izuku said, and without another word he walked past them, through the gates, and into the heart of the great, failing experiment. The main courtyard of UA had been transformed into a refugee camp. Tents were pitched on the manicured lawns. Lines of gaunt-faced civilians snaked towards makeshift soup kitchens. The air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and the wet wool scent of fear. Exhausted-looking heroes moved among the crowds, offering what little comfort they could. Izuku walked through it all like a surgeon surveying a terminal patient. He saw everything with a terrifying new clarity. He saw the hero handing a child a piece of candy and recognized it not as an act of kindness, but as a futile attempt to apply a psychological bomb to a wound that was fundamentally societal. He saw a group of students from Class 1B reinforcing a wall, and saw them merely patching a crack in a structure whose foundations were sand. His gaze fell upon Achiko Uraraka. She was sitting on a bench, her expression gentle and tired, as she used her zero-gravity quirk to make a small, crying girl's teddy bear float just out of reach, turning the child's sobs into hesitant giggles. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated sweetness. The old Izuku would have felt his heart ache with admiration and affection. The new Izuku analyzed it. Subject: Uraraka Achiko. Action: palliative emotional care. Quirk application: trivial. Result: a temporary cessation of distress in a single unit. Long-term prognosis for the unit: unchanged. Systemic impact: 0. Conclusion: a beautiful, pointless gesture. Like decorating a condemned building. The coldness of the thought didn't disturb him. It felt correct. It felt logical. Deku-kun? He turned. Achiko had noticed him. The floating teddy bear dropped back into the little girl's lap as she deactivated her quirk. A genuine, radiant smile spread across her face, a small sunbeam in the oppressive gloom. You're back. We were so worried. She ran to him, her arms open for an embrace, a hug that had been promised in the heat of their last true battle. But she stopped a foot away, her smile faltering as she met his eyes. She saw what Ida had seen. The emptiness. The stillness. You're hurt, she said, her voice small. My physical condition is irrelevant, he said, her face crumpled with confusion and hurt. Irrelevant? Deku-kun, what are you talking about? Look at you. You need to rest, you need. What I need, he interrupted, his voice perfectly even, is to address the foundational flaw. Everything else is a distraction. He looked from her, to the crying child she had just comforted, to the lines of refugees. All of this, it's a symptom. You are all treating symptoms. It is inefficient. It is illogical. It prolongs the suffering. Achiko took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. This wasn't the Deku she knew. This wasn't the boy who cried for his friends, who broke his own body to save one person, who embodied the very concept of selfless, emotional heroism. This was a stranger wearing his face. What happened to you out there? She whispered, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. He simply looked at her, his ancient eyes offering no explanation, and walked away, leaving her standing alone, the cold dread of his presence lingering long after he was gone. Deep within the metaphysical space that had once been the vibrant nexus of one for all, the vestiges were screaming into a void. The world they inhabited was a ruin. The familiar landscape of chairs in a sunlit, abstract space was now a monochrome nightmare. The chairs were fractured, some turned to dust, others flickering in and out of existence like faulty holograms. The sun was gone, replaced by an oppressive, non-luminous gray sky. The entire realm was permeated by a low, silent hum, the presence of the anti-monitor. It was an anti-frequency that cancelled out their very essence, a cosmic static that shredded their voices and tethered them in place. They were prisoners. Worse, they were spectators. They were forced to see through Izuku's eyes, feel his cold detachment, and process his horrifyingly logical thoughts. He's looking at Uraraka, Nana Shimura's essence wailed, her form flickering violently. He's looking at that sweet girl, and he feels nothing. Nothing but calculation. Yoichi, do something. Yoichi Shigaraki, the first, was almost translucent, his form barely holding together against the corrosive silence. He was closer to the core of the power, and thus, closer to the infection. I can't, his thought echoed, thin and reedy. It's wrapped around him. Around us. It's not controlling him like a puppet. It's affirming him. It took the single greatest flaw in his spirit, his absolute, self-destructive desire to save everyone, and twisted it into its own philosophy. It's using his own compassion as the engine for its destruction. They watched in horror as Izuku walked through the halls of UA. They saw him pass Shoto Todoroki, who was using his ice powers to create refrigerated units for medical supplies. They felt Izuku's cold assessment, a clever application of a volatile power. But it still serves the failing system. He is merely making the sick more comfortable as they die. They saw everything. They felt everything. And they could do nothing. Their legacy, their combined power that was meant to be a beacon of hope, had become the vessel for the universe's end. They were ghosts trapped in the machine of the apocalypse, forced to watch their beloved successor pilot it towards oblivion. Listen to me, ninth. Izuku. Nana focused all her remaining will, trying to push a single thought through the oppressive static. This is not salvation. This is despair wearing the mask of logic. Remember the smiles. Remember why you fight. For a moment, a flicker of an image reached Izuku's consciousness, the smiling face of the woman he'd saved from the sludge villain. The cosmic hum in his mind intensified for a fraction of a second. The memory was instantly analyzed and dismissed. Data point: 1 successful rescue. Consequence: the subject was later endangered by the Kamino Ward incident. Net result: a temporary reprieve from a systemic threat. The smile was an ephemeral chemical reaction based on incomplete data. Nana's essence recoiled as if struck. Her attempt had failed. Worse, it had been effortlessly co-opted by the new, horrifying logic. They were not just prisoners. Their very memories were being used as fuel for the nihilistic fire. Izuku found a quiet, and used locker room to serve as his base of operations. He didn't need to sleep, but he needed to calibrate. He sat on a bench in the dark, the silence a comfortable blanket. He could feel the new power within him, a perfectly controlled singularity in his soul. It was time to understand its practical applications. He needed a target. A test case. He closed his eyes, not to rest, but to expand his senses. Danger sense, once a spike of anxiety, was now a calm, topographical map of suffering. He could filter it, analyze it, pinpoint the sources of conflict with unnerving precision. He ignored the grand, heroic struggles. He was looking for a microcosm of the flaw. He found it in the city's guts, in an abandoned subway station 2 miles away. The data streamed into his mind, a small group of refugees, driven from the UA, sheltered by overcrowding and fear, were being preyed upon. 3 aggressors, their quirks making them bold. The conflict was small, meaningless in the grand scheme of things, and for that reason, it was perfect. It was a pure sample of the disease. He stood up. His movements were fluid and silent. He slipped out of UA as easily as he had entered, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He didn't need to announce his departure. His mission was no longer aligned with theirs. The journey to the subway station was a study in efficiency. He moved through the ruined city with the path of least resistance, his new perspective allowing him to see the flow of energy and the lines of probability. He arrived at the graffiti-scarred entrance to the station and descended the motionless escalator into the subterranean darkness. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of mold and desperation. Far down the platform he saw them. 3 men, their faces illuminated by a flickering lantern. They had cornered a small family, a mother, a father, and a teenage son, against the grimy tile of the station wall. "Just give us the medicine," one of the men rasped. He was a gaunt figure, and when he spoke, small, sharp shards of what looked like obsidian grew from his forearms. A bone generation quirk, crude, but effective for intimidation. And the food, a second, heavy-set man added. His quirk was less visible, but Izuku could sense the low-frequency sonic waves he was emitting, causing the family to flinch and cover their ears in pain. "Please," the refugee father begged, holding up his hands. "It's all we have. My wife is sick." "The world's sick, pal," the third man sneered, kicking over the family's meager bag of supplies. "Time to get used to it." Izuku began to walk towards them down the long, dark platform. His footsteps made no sound. He was not emanating any energy, not flexing any power. He was simply an approaching silhouette against the dim light of the station entrance. The villains heard him first. Or rather, they sensed him. The sonic user stopped his pulse, his head snapping up. "Who's there?" Izuku continued his steady, unhurried pace. "Hey! This is our territory. Get lost or get hurt." The bone-shard villain shouted, brandishing his razor-sharp arms. He was 20 feet away now. The family stared at him, their expressions a mixture of terror and a faint, dying ember of hope. They saw his familiar silhouette, the wild green hair, the iconic mask hanging around his neck. It was the ghost. The vigilante Deku. They were saved. Izuku came to a stop 10 feet from the aggressors. He looked not at the villains, but at their quirks. He saw them for what they were, chaotic, unpredictable variables, spontaneous, destabilizing powers that elevated the cruel and the strong over the weak. They were random, cancerous mutations on the genome of humanity. They had to be excised. Last chance, hero, the bone-shard villain growled, taking a step forward. Turn around. Izuku slowly raised his right hand. There was no crackle of green lightning. No surge of power. The air around his palms simply thinned. The villain lunged, his arm a scythe of black bone shards aimed at Izuku's throat. Izuku did not move. He did not dodge. He simply held his hand up, palm open. Just before the lethal arm reached him, a point of blackness, no bigger than a marble, materialized in the air between them. It was not a shadow. It was a hole. A perfect sphere of non-existence that seemed to drink the light around it. The bone shards, inches from the sphere, stopped growing. The villain's eyes went wide with confusion. His arm, from the wrist to the elbow, touched the sphere. There was no sound. No explosion. No flash of light. The villain's arm was simply gone, not severed. Not disintegrated. It was erased. From the elbow down, there was just smooth, unblemished skin, as if the arm had never grown any further. The bone shard quirk, the source of the mutation, had been unmade. The man stared at his newly formed stump, his brain unable to process what it was seeing. There was no blood, no wound. Just a clean, perfect ending. A scream of pure, primal terror finally ripped itself from his throat, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. The other two villains were frozen in shock. Izuku turned his calm, analytical gaze to the sonic user. What did you do? The man stammered, taking a step back. Izuku raised his hand again. The man panicked, trying to unleash his quirk, to blast Izuku with a disorienting sonic pulse. He strained, his face turning red, but nothing happened. It was like trying to fire a gun that had been filled with concrete. Izuku took a step forward. Your power. It is a flaw in the design. An error. He reached out, his fingers moving with an unnerving gentleness, and touched the man's forehead. The silent, creeping blackness of his antimatter power, invisible to the naked eye, flowed from his fingertips. It wasn't an attack. It was a correction. He targeted the specific region of the man's brain, the source of the quirk factor, and erased it. He unmade the genetic mistake. The sonic user collapsed to the ground, not unconscious, but utterly vacant. The part of his identity that had been tied to his power, the confidence and cruelty it gave him, had been scooped out of his soul, leaving a hollowed-out shell of a man. The third villain, who had no discernible quirk beyond his own pathetic cruelty, simply broke. He scrambled backwards, fell over the family's supplies, and Crab walked away into the darkness, his whimpers echoing down the tunnel. Izuku lowered his hand. He looked at the two men he had dealt with. One was screaming at his own perfectly formed stump. The other was staring blankly at the ceiling, drool trickling from his mouth. He felt nothing. No satisfaction. No pity. No anger. He felt the cold, quiet correctness of a balanced equation. He had not punished them. He had not defeated them. He had edited them. He had removed the flawed variable, restoring them to a baseline state of powerlessness. He had, in his own new, terrible way, saved them from themselves. He turned to the refugee family. They were huddled together, staring at him with a terror far greater than any the villains had inspired. They had expected a hero. They had witnessed something else entirely, something alien. Something absolute. The father shielded his wife and son, pushing them behind him. Stay away from us, he stammered. Izuku looked at him, at the raw fear in his eyes. He understood it. It was the fear of the unknown. The fear of a power that did not fight, but simply erased. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had confirmed the application of his power. The test was complete. He turned and walked away, his silent footsteps carrying him back into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving behind the whimpering, the screaming, and a new kind of fear that would begin to poison the city's desperate hope. The ghost of Muzitiful was no longer just a vigilante. He was a force of nature, and his nature was the void. 2 days. For 2 days, Izuku Midoriya was a ghost within the walls of UA, a void moving through the panicked, teeming masses. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He observed, he processed, and he planned. The cold, silent hum of the anti-monitor's logic was a constant companion, a lens through which he viewed the world, stripping away all sentimentality and emotion, leaving only the stark, brutal calculus of his new purpose. He saw his classmates, the vibrant and powerful Class 1A, and felt nothing but a distant, analytical pity. He watched Kirishima and Tetsu organize work crews to reinforce the perimeter, their unbreakable skin and indomitable spirits a bulwark against the chaos. A futile effort, his mind supplied. They are merely polishing the bars of their own cage. He saw Yaoyorozu, her brow furrowed in concentration as she created complex medical equipment from her own cells, her face pale with exhaustion. A brilliant mind, a miraculous quirk, all of it marshaled in service of propping up a system doomed to collapse. She is a master physician attempting to cure a patient whose very DNA is poison. He saw them all, his friends, his comrades, the people he once would have died for without a second thought. And he saw them as flawed variables in a flawed equation. Their heroism, their hope, their love, they were beautiful, irrational data points that only served to perpetuate the cycle of suffering. They were the problem, and they thought they were the solution. His plan had crystallized during this period of observation. Random acts of correction, like the one in the subway, were inefficient. They addressed individual symptoms, not the disease itself. To truly begin the great erasure, he had to strike at the system's heart. He had to unmake a symbol, not a person. The unmaking of a person was a tactical decision, not a strategic one. He needed to erase a concept. And in their broken society, concepts were housed in concrete and steel. His target was the Hero Public Safety Commission headquarters. It was more than just a building. It was the brain of Hero society. It was the seat of power that dictated the laws, issued the licenses, and manipulated public perception. It was the institution that had turned heroism from a selfless act into a regulated, bureaucratic profession. It was the source of the rot, the place where the ideals of all might were codified, commodified, and ultimately corrupted. It was the central nervous system of the lie. To erase it would be a declaration. It would be a statement of intent so profound and terrifying that the world would have no choice but to listen. On the 3rd day, at dawn, he left UA. No one saw him go. He simply wasn't there anymore. He moved through the sleeping city, a silent wraith navigating the pre-dawn gloom. The first rays of sunlight were beginning to lance through the clouds, painting the undersides of the smog in hues of sickly orange and purple. It was the dawn of a new era. His era. He arrived at the HPSC complex as the city was beginning to stir. The headquarters was a fortress of mirrored glass and stark, brutalist architecture, a towering monolith that projected an aura of unassailable authority. It had survived the war mostly intact, a testament to its own importance. Around it, a perimeter had been established, manned by a cadre of sidekicks and lower-tier pro-heroes, their expressions a mixture of grim duty and nervous tension. Izuku didn't approach the perimeter. He didn't seek a confrontation. He walked to the center of the wide, empty plaza that stretched before the building, placing himself directly in view of the main entrance and the dozens of security cameras that studded its facade. He simply stood there. A lone, small figure in a tattered green costume, his presence a quiet challenge to the massive structure before him. It took less than a minute for the alarms to sound. They were not the frantic sirens of a villain attack. They were the cold, blaring claxons of an institutional lockdown. Floodlights ignited, bathing the plaza in harsh, sterile white light. Panels slid open on the building's facade, revealing automated defense turrets that hummed with stored energy. The heroes at the perimeter snapped to attention, their eyes wide, focusing on the impossible figure who had appeared from nowhere. Inside the building's primary command center, chaos erupted. "It's him! The vigilante Deku!" An operator shouted, his voice cracking. "How did he get through the outer sensors?" There was no energy reading, no approach vector. Another yelled, her fingers flying across a keyboard. The current president of the HPSC, a severe-looking woman named Chio Tanegashima, stared at the massive central monitor, her face a mask of cold fury. He didn't get through anything, she said, her voice dangerously low. He's making a statement. Seal the building. Deploy the Aegis units. I want him contained. Her voice held a particular venom when she spoke of him. Midoriya was the symbol of everything that had gone wrong, the breakdown of protocol, the rise of vigilantism, the failure of their carefully constructed system. He was an anomaly they had failed to control, and now he was on their doorstep. Back in the plaza, Izuku watched the building's response with detached curiosity. The turrets swiveled to lock onto him. He could feel the energy building within their capacitors, could calculate the trajectory of their projectiles to the millimeter. It was all so predictable. So loud, he didn't move. He simply waited. From the building's main entrance, 3 figures emerged. The first was the rabbit hero, Mirko. Her powerful legs were tensed, her white hair like a flag of war, and her crimson eyes were narrowed with ferocious intent. She was pure, unadulterated aggression. The second was the shield hero, Crust. Tall, noble, and radiating a quiet strength, he was one of the few top 10 heroes to survive the war, albeit with significant injuries. He stood as a symbol of heroic endurance. The third, emerging from the sky with a whisper of controlled flame, was the new number 1 hero, Endeavor. His expression was a thunderous scowl, his turquoise eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with his quirk. He had spent the last several weeks trying to hold the world together with sheer force of will, and the last thing he needed was the number 1 problem child showing up to cause more trouble. Midoriya! Endeavor's voice boomed across the plaza, a gravelly roar of command. Stand down. Whatever you think you're doing it on the wrong side of the law. Izuku slowly lifted his head, his calm gaze sweeping over the 3 top heroes. He saw Mirko's kinetic potential, the microfractures and crust shields from past battles, the barely controlled inferno raging within Endeavor's body and soul. He saw 3 powerful, determined individuals, all of them missing the point. The law? Izuku's voice was quiet, yet it carried across the plaza with unnatural clarity. Your laws are the operating manual for a failed machine. They do not need to be followed. They need to be deleted. The sheer arrogance of the statement, delivered with such unnerving calm, stunned them into a moment of silence. Mirko was the first to recover. Deleted? You got a real big mouth for a little punk who looks like he hasn't slept in a month, she snarled, dropping into a low crouch. Last chance? Let's talk this out before I have to rearrange your bones. There is nothing to talk about, Izuku said. Only something to be done. He raised his right hand. That was the only signal they needed. Engage! Endeavor roared. The world exploded into motion. The automated turrets unleashed a volley of high-density stun rounds, each one capable of incapacitating a charging rhinoceros. Mirko became a white blur, kicking off the ground with such force that the pavement cracked, her trajectory a missile aimed at Izuku's center mass. From above, Endeavor unleashed a concentrated jet of blue flame, a hell spider thread designed not to kill, but to incinerate and entrap. It was a perfectly coordinated, overwhelming assault by some of the strongest individuals on the planet, and it was utterly, completely useless. Izuku didn't move a muscle. He simply stood there as the maelstrom of destruction converged on him. As the stun rounds and the jet of flame approached, the air around him seemed to warp. A subtle, silent wave of blackness emanated from his body, an invisible sphere of antimatter that was his new, passive defense. The stun rounds, upon entering this sphere, did not ricochet. They did not explode. They simply ceased to exist. One moment they were high-velocity projectiles, the next they were nothing, their matter and energy unwritten from the ledger of reality. Endeavor's flames met the same fate. The brilliant blue fire, hot enough to melt steel, simply vanished as it touched the edge of the aura. It didn't fizzle or die out. It was extinguished so completely it was as if it had never been created, leaving no heat, no smoke, only a creeping, absolute cold. Endeavor's eyes widened in disbelief. He had fought all for one. He had battled Hyan Nomu. He had never seen anything like this. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't a counter. It was a negation. Mirko, already mid-flight, had no time to process this. Her powerful leg, aimed for a devastating Lunati Harris kick, swung through the space where Izuku stood, but as her boot entered the invisible field, she felt a horrifying sensation. It wasn't pain. It was worse. It was a feeling of dissolution. She instinctively recoiled, twisting her body in midair and landing hard 50 feet away. She looked down at her armored boot. The reinforced metal toe cap was gone. Not shattered, not melted. It had been shaved away as if by an invisible, infinitely sharp blade, leaving a perfectly smooth, unblemished edge. If she had been a fraction of a second slower, it would have taken her foot. A cold sweat beaded on her forehead. The pure, predatory instinct that had guided her through countless battles was now screaming at her. A single, primal warning: do not touch him. Crust, who had been moving to intercept with his shields, froze, his face pale. He had seen it all. He understood. This wasn't a quirk. This was something else. This was a violation of the laws of physics. What is that power? He breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Izuku lowered his hand, his expression unchanged. The failed assault had been nothing more than a mild curiosity to him. This is not power, Izuku said, his calm voice a counterpoint to their shock. Power is what you use. It is a tool for creation and destruction. It is part of the flawed system. This, he said, gesturing to the empty air around him, is a correction. It is the end of power. He turned his back on them. He began to walk towards the HPSC headquarters. His pace was unhurried, his posture relaxed. It was the single most insulting, arrogant gesture he could have made. He was dismissing the three top heroes as if they were nothing more than buzzing insects. Endeavor's pride, a thing of volcanic fury, could not abide it. With a roar of rage, he swooped down, gathering his flames for his ultimate move. Vanishing jet burn. He unleashed a massive, concentrated torrent of his hottest flames, a blow that had once incinerated a high-end. It was an attack born of pure fury and disbelief. It washed over Izuku, engulfing him completely. For a moment, the entire plaza was a sea of incandescent fire, and then, just as quickly, the fire was gone. Erased. Izuku stood in the center of the fading heat shimmer, his tattered costume completely untouched. He hadn't even flinched. He paused his walk, turning his head slightly to look back at Endeavor. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no triumph. There was only a profound, dismissive pity. Your efforts are illogical, he stated simply. You are trying to burn the ocean. He turned back to the building and continued his slow, inexorable walk. Inside the command center, the HPSC president watched her most powerful assets be rendered utterly impotent. The clinical fury on her face had been replaced by a sliver of genuine, icy fear. All Aegis units, she commanded, her voice tight. Full power. Overwrite safety protocols. I don't want him contained. I want him erased. From hidden alcoves along the building's base, a dozen sleek, heavily armed Endrids deployed. They were the HPSC's ultimate answer to overwhelming threats, each one equipped with technology designed to analyze and neutralize any quirk. They moved with silent, inhuman speed, surrounding Izuku. Izuku didn't even break his stride. As the Endrids opened fire with cryobeams, sonic pulses, and EMP blasts, his passive aura of unmaking simply consumed it all. It was like throwing handfuls of sand at a black hole. He was 50 feet from the main doors now. He stopped. He had made his point. He had demonstrated the futility of resistance. Now, it was time for the declaration. He raised both his hands, palms facing the towering glass and steel monolith. This is the heart of the illusion, he said, his voice now amplified by some unknown means, booming across the plaza and echoing off the surrounding buildings. It was a voice for the world to hear. This is where heroism was chained and salvation was made a commodity. It is a monument to the flaw. And all flawed things must be erased. A deep, profound blackness began to coalesce around his hands. It was not the passive, invisible aura from before. This was a deliberate, concentrated application of his power. It was the color of a dead universe, a tangible piece of the void. The blackness swirled and writhed, pulling at the light, silencing the air around it. It was a hungry, silent nothingness. Mirko, Endeavor, and Crust watched in horror. They could feel the wrongness of it in their very bones. This wasn't just destruction. This was desecration. Stop him! Endeavor roared, a desperate, futile command. They charged. Mirko pushed her body to its absolute limit, her movements a blur of white and red. Crust threw up a wall of shields, a final, desperate attempt to create a barrier. Endeavor unleashed every ounce of fire he could muster, but they were too far away. They were too slow. Izuku pushed his hands forward. The concentrated sphere of antimatter shot forward, not like a projectile, but like an expanding wave of absolute negation. It moved with an unnatural speed, swallowing the ground as it went. The Aegis units in its path were the first to go. They didn't explode. Their metal bodies, their complex circuitry, their very existence was simply wiped from the canvas of reality, leaving behind perfectly smooth, empty patches of pavement. The wave of erasure struck the base of the Hero Public Safety Commission headquarters. There was no explosion. No shattering glass. No groaning metal. There was only a profound, all-consuming silence. The bottom 20 floors of the massive skyscraper simply vanished. One moment, a towering symbol of authority. The next, a gaping, silent void. The mirrored glass, the reinforced concrete, the steel girders, the offices, the computers, the data archives, all of it was gone, unmade as if it had been a dream. The laws of physics, however, could not be so easily erased. The upper 80 floors of the building, their foundations now non-existent, hung in the air for a single, impossible moment. Then, with a groan that sounded like the planet itself breaking, they began to fall. The colossal structure collapsed in on itself, a waterfall of glass and steel and shattered concrete, crashing into the newly created void in a plume of dust and debris that blotted out the sun. The shockwave of the collapse threw the three heroes back. The ground shook as if from a massive earthquake. For a full minute, the world was nothing but the roar of a dying titan and a cloud of gray dust. When the dust began to settle, the scene was one of apocalyptic devastation. Where the HPSC headquarters had stood, there was now a mountain of rubble and twisted metal, smoke and fire pouring from its heart. And standing before it all, untouched, was Izuku Midoriya. He stood in the center of the devastation he had wrought, his expression as placid and serene as ever. He had not just destroyed a building, he had surgically removed a concept from the world, and let the messy, chaotic laws of reality clean up the rest. He had sent his message. He turned his gaze from the rubble, letting it sweep over the horrified faces of Endeavor, Mirko, and Crust. They were staring at him not as a misguided youth or a powerful villain, but as something utterly alien. A cosmic horror in the shape of a boy they once knew. Without another word, Izuku turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the dust and chaos as silently as he had arrived. His declaration was made. The world now knew that their greatest symbol of hope had become an agent of absolute erasure. And he was just getting started. The unmaking of the Hero Public Safety Commission headquarters was not a news story. It was a schism in reality. The footage, captured by a dozen traffic cameras, news helicopters, and civilian phones, played on a constant, horrified loop across every screen in Japan, and then, the world. There was no spin, no possible misinterpretation. One moment, the heart of the hero system stood. The next, it was a gaping wound in the sky, brought down by the boy who was supposed to be its future. The world didn't just panic. It fractured. Fear, already a rampant plague, mutated into something colder, something more primal. Villains, who had been emboldened by the hero's weakness, now hesitated, looking over their shoulders not for heroes, but for the silent, walking void that could unmake them. Civilians, who had lost faith in heroes, now had a new entity to dread, a terror that defied all known categories. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was an apocalypse in a green suit. And at the epicenter of this global tremor was UA High School. The fortress had become a pressure cooker, and the pressure had just quadrupled. The news of Deku's actions swept through the refugee-filled halls like a shockwave, leaving a trail of stunned silence, weeping, and frantic, whispered speculation. The students of Class 1A were a tight, isolated knot in the center of the storm, buffeted by the fear of the public and the grim, stony silence of their teachers. They were huddled in their dorm common room, the television screen frozen on a grainy image of Izuku standing before the mountain of rubble. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. It was a mixture of disbelief, horror, and a profound, personal sense of betrayal. "It can't be him," Kaminari whispered, his voice trembling. He looked as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "It's a trick. A deep fake. Some villain with a body-snatching quirk." "Look at his eyes," Tokoemi said, his voice a low rasp. Dark shadow coiled nervously behind him, a living barometer of the room's despair. "The abyss has stared back, and it has taken residence." "But why?" Mina Ashido cried, her hands twisting in her lap. "Why would Deku, why would he do that? He cries when he sees a lost cat. He doesn't erase buildings." The question hung in the air, unanswerable and agonizing. They had all seen his decline. They had watched him shoulder the weight of the world, had seen the light in his eyes dim under the pressure of his solo crusade. But they had believed, with the earnest conviction of youth, that his core, that pure, unshakable heroism, was immutable. To see this act of cold, absolute destruction was like watching the sun rise in the west. It broke the fundamental laws of the universe. In the center of the group sat Ochiko Uraraka. She was pale, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She remembered his eyes. The flat, ancient calmness, the way he had looked at her, at the crying child, and assessed them like pieces on a board. "Everything else is a distraction," he had said. The memory sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He had meant it. This was what he'd meant. Tenya Ida stood rigidly by the window, his back to the group, staring out at the fortified grounds. His fists were clenched at his sides. He was the class president. He was Izuku's friend. He was supposed to embody order, to provide guidance. But what guidance could you offer in the face of such cosmic chaos? What rule book contained a chapter on your closest friend becoming a god of destruction? "We cannot stand by," Ida said finally, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. He turned to face them, his expression one of fierce, desperate resolve. "Speculation is useless. Accusation is premature. What is required is confirmation. We must find him. We must talk to him." "And say what, Ida?" Ciro asked, his usual levity gone. "Hey man, cool new power, but maybe don't unmake any more national landmarks. We say the truth," Ida declared, chopping the air with his hand, a gesture that was now more frantic than firm. "We remind him of who he is, of who we are to him, the bond between us, the memories we share, they cannot be so easily erased." His words, meant to be a rallying cry, hung in the air with a desperate, tragic weight. They all knew the power of their bond. They had literally pulled Izuku back from the brink once before with their words, with their connection. But this felt different. The boy they had pulled back was a boy drowning in responsibility. The boy on the screen was someone who had climbed out of the water and decided to drain the ocean. It was Ochiko who gave voice to their course of action. She stood up, her small frame radiating a strength that surprised everyone. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her gaze was steady. "Ida-kun is right," she said, her voice clear and firm. "We can't just sit here. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know what that power is, or what it's done to his mind, but I know Deku-kun is still in there. The boy who saved me from that zero-pointer. The boy who told me my name was an inspiration. He's in there. And we are going to get him back." There was a murmur of agreement. Her simple, heartfelt conviction was an anchor in the swirling vortex of fear. "But how do we find him?" asked Toru Hagakure, her disembodied voice trembling. "He could be anywhere." A new voice cut through the room, cool and sharp. "No, he couldn't." All heads turned to Shoto Todoroki. He had been sitting silently in the corner, his heterochromatic eyes fixed on the television. He rose to his feet, a thoughtful, analytical expression on his face. "He's operating on a new form of logic, but he's still Midoriya," Shoto explained, his voice even. "His actions are grand, symbolic. But his anchor points, the places his subconscious will return to, are sentimental. He is a creature of habit and heart. Think. Where would he go to be alone? To think? A place that is important to him. The room was silent for a moment as they all considered this. Then, a collective realization dawned. Dagobah Beach, Achiko whispered. It was perfect. The place where it had all begun. The site of his first impossible trial, the place he had transformed himself from a powerless boy into a worthy vessel for All Might's power. It was a monument to his own hope and determination. It was exactly the kind of place a lost soul would return to, seeking the ghost of the person they used to be. We go there, Achiko said, her resolve hardening. Just a few of us. A big group will feel like a confrontation. We need to approach him as friends, not as heroes trying to stop him. A small team was quickly decided. Achiko, the emotional core, the one who connected with him on a level no one else could. Ida, the voice of their shared past and their class's steadfast loyalty. Shoto, whose own journey from a dark, isolated past gave him a unique perspective on internal struggle. And Tsuyu Ajui, whose blunt honesty and unwavering perception would cut through any deception. Kero. Bakugo was conspicuously absent from the discussion. He had been sitting in the corner, seething, his hands sparking with tiny, furious explosions. This wasn't something he could solve with words. This was a perversion, a betrayal that ran deeper than friendship. He would find Izuku, but he would do it his own way. This appeal from the heart was, to him, a waste of breath. Ignoring the lockdown protocols and the frantic calls of their teachers, the small groups slipped out of UA under the cover of the ensuing chaos. Their journey to Dagobah Beach was a tense, silent trek through a city that held its breath. Dagobah Beach was serene under the bruised twilight sky. The last time Izuku had stood here, it had been a mountain of rusting trash, a testament to societal neglect. Now, thanks to his own Herculean efforts, it was pristine. The sand was clean, the water lapped gently at the shore, and the setting sun cast long, peaceful shadows. He stood at the water's edge, his back to the city, facing the endless expanse of the ocean. He was not admiring the view. He was contemplating infinity. The ocean, to him, was a beautiful, simple system. Its depths held chaos and violence, but its surface, governed by the moon and the wind, was a predictable, rhythmic whole. It was a system in equilibrium. A state he wished to grant the world. The anti-monitor's logic was a cool, clear stream in his mind. This place. It is a monument to a flawed premise, that one man, through sheer effort, could prepare himself to inherit a flawed power to perpetuate a flawed system. A noble, but misguided, expenditure of energy. He heard them approach. 4 distinct sets of footsteps in the sand. He did not turn. He had calculated a 78.4% probability that his former comrades would seek him out here. Their arrival was an expected variable. Deku-kun. Achiko's voice was soft, hesitant, like the breeze coming off the water. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. Midoriya, Ida said, his voice straining to be formal but cracking with emotion. We saw the news. We need you to talk to us? To explain. Izuku slowly turned. He faced the 4 of them, his friends, his family. They were arrayed before him, their faces a tapestry of fear, hope, and confusion. He looked at them, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than cold logic stirred within him. It was a vestige of a memory, a ghost of an emotion. It was regret, not for his actions, but for the pain his necessary actions were causing them. An unfortunate but necessary byproduct of the correction, the silent logic supplied. Their emotional distress is a symptom of their attachment to the flawed system. It will pass, as all things will pass. There is nothing to explain, Izuku said, his voice the calm, flat tone they now dreaded. There is only what must be done. What must be done? Tsuyu croaked, her large eyes blinking slowly. Destroying buildings, Midoriya-chan? Terrifying everyone? That's not what you do. Kero. You save people. I am saving people, Izuku replied, his gaze sweeping over them. You are thinking on too small a scale. You save a person from a burning building. I am saving all of existence from the fire. You pull a drowning man from the sea. I am calming the storm that sinks all ships. His words, so grandiose and detached, were chilling. Shoto took a step forward, his expression serious. My father was obsessed with power, he said, his voice low and steady. It twisted him. It made him hurt people. It made him hurt me. I look at you now, Midoriya, and I see the same thing. This power you have. It's twisting you. Izuku's head tilted slightly, a flicker of analytical interest in his eyes. Your father sought power for personal gain, to satisfy his ego. His goal was to elevate himself within the system. My goal is to erase the system itself. The motivations are axiomatically different. Your analogy is flawed. The cold, clinical dismissal of Shoto's heartfelt comparison was like a slap in the face. Ida, unable to contain himself, strode forward. This is not you, he boomed, his voice echoing across the empty beach. You are Midoriya Izuku. Our classmate. Our friend. The boy who inspired all of us with his limitless heroism. The boy who fought gentle criminal not for fame or glory, but to protect the simple joy of a school festival. Do you remember that? Do you remember the smiles on everyone's faces? Izuku's eyes did not flicker. I remember a temporary cessation of anxiety in a localized population, induced by a controlled social event. A fleeting distraction from the ever-present suffering caused by the system we were celebrating. The smiles were meaningless. The word meaningless struck Ochako like a physical blow. She staggered back, a gasp escaping her lips. That was the core of it. That was the horror. He had taken their most cherished memories, the very foundation of their friendship, and rendered them worthless through his new, terrible lens. Tears began to stream down her face. Not just for her friend, but for the beautiful, hopeful world he was trying to unmake, a world she still believed in. No, she sobbed, shaking her head. No, they weren't meaningless. That smile you gave me, after you saved me at the entrance exam. That wasn't meaningless. The way you looked at All Might. The way you looked at all of us. You taught us what it means to be a hero, Deku-kun. You. Not your power, not one for all. You. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand outstretched, her face a heartbreaking mess of tears and desperate hope. Please. Deku-kun. Izuku. Whatever that thing is inside you, whatever it's telling you, it's lying. The world isn't a problem to be solved. It's our home. And it's worth fighting for. The pain, the struggle, all of it, it's worth it. Because of the smiles. Because of the love. Because of us. Her plea was raw, honest, and filled with the entirety of her heart. It was a pure, concentrated appeal to the boy she knew was still buried under layers of cosmic nihilism. For a single, breathtaking moment, it seemed to work. Izuku's placid expression wavered. His brow furrowed in something that looked like confusion, like pain. The empty stillness in his eyes was disturbed, like a stone dropped into a deep, dark pool. A flicker of green, the ghost of one for all, sparked deep within his pupils. Inside him, the vestiges felt it. A crack in the suffocating silence. Ochiko's words, powered by her genuine love, had acted like a tuning fork, resonating with the core frequency of the real Izuku Midoriya. He heard her. Nana Shimura's essence cried out, surging against its metaphysical chains. Push, Yoichi! All of us, push now! They focused all their waning energy, all their desperate hope, on that single crack. They weren't trying to fight the anti-monitor. They were trying to reach their successor. They flooded his consciousness with the feeling behind Ochiko's words, the warmth of her hand, the memory of her floating in the sky during the sports festival, the fierce loyalty in her eyes when she had defended him against the civilian mob. Izuku's hand twitched. His mouth opened, and a single, choked sound escaped. Yura, Raka. His own voice sounded alien to him. It was the voice of a boy, not a god. The cold logic of the anti-monitor faltered, momentarily drowned out by a tidal wave of pure, human emotion. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a data point, but as Ochiko. His friend. The girl who made his heart feel like it was floating. The pain of what he was doing, what he was becoming, hit him with the force of a physical blow. But the anti-monitor was not some petty demon to be exorcised by the power of love. It was a cosmic absolute. And it had anchored itself to the most fundamental part of Izuku's being. It reacted to this intrusion not with anger, but with overwhelming, irrefutable logic. The emotional response is a flaw in your original programming. The thought slid into his mind, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. This attachment creates pain. The very love she speaks of is the source of your current distress. If you care for her, the logical course of action is to complete your task, so she will no longer have anything to suffer for. The only true kindness you can offer her is the peace of the void. The logic was flawless. It was twisted. It was monstrous. And it was irrefutable. The flicker of green in Izuku's eyes was snuffed out, consumed by the returning, bottomless black. The confusion on his face smoothed out, replaced by a serenity that was now more terrifying than ever, because they had seen it break. They had seen the boy underneath, and now he was gone again. He looked at Ochiko's outstretched hand, her tear-streaked face, her trembling hope. And he gave her his final answer. He raised his own hand, not to take hers, but to create a barrier. A small, shimmering pane of antimatter, a 2-foot square of pure nothingness, materialized in the air between them. It was perfectly transparent, yet it warped the light around it, making the sunset behind him look bent and broken. Your appeal is based on flawed, emotional axioms, he said, his voice once again flat and devoid of life. It is illogical. Your presence here is inefficient. Shoto reacted instantly. With a stomp of his foot, a massive wave of ice erupted from the sand, surging towards Izuku. It wasn't just an attack, it was a wall, an attempt to separate him from them, to break the horrifying spell. The ice wave crashed against the small pane of nothingness. There was no impact. The massive glacier of ice simply ceased to exist where it touched the barrier, erased molecule by molecule, leaving a perfectly smooth, vertical cliff of ice hanging in the air for a moment before it collapsed under its own weight. Izuku looked at them, his eyes sweeping over his oldest friends. You cannot stop this. You cannot fight a concept. You are attempting to punch mathematics. He took a step back, the antimatter barrier dissolving into nothing. Do not seek me out again, he said. It was not a threat. It was a genuine warning. A plea in its own twisted way. He was still Izuku Midoriya enough to not want to erase them. The next time we meet, I may not be able to guarantee your continued existence. The correction must proceed. And then, he was gone. He didn't run. He didn't use a quirk. He simply stepped back into the shadows beneath the pier, and when they blinked, the space where he had been was empty. They were left alone on the darkening beach. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the waves and Ochiko Uraraka's heartbroken sobs. She collapsed to her knees in the sand, the last of her strength gone, her appeal from the heart shattered against a wall of cosmic nihilism. They had reached for their friend, and he had shown them a pane of the void. They had seen a flicker of the boy they loved, only to have him be extinguished before their very eyes. It was worse than just finding a monster. They had found their friend, seen him recognize them, and then watched him choose to let the monster win. The fight for Izuku Midoriya's soul was not over, but they had just lost a critical, soul-crushing battle. Katsuki Bakugo did not deal in grief. Grief was a stagnant pool, a passive acceptance of loss. Bakugo dealt in rage. Rage was a wildfire. It was active, it was cleansing, and it was the only emotion that made sense in a world that had gone completely, utterly insane. He hadn't joined the appeal from the heart. He'd watched them go from the dorm window, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his knuckles white. He'd listened to their half-baked plan with a sneer of contempt. Talk to him? Remind him of who he was? It was like trying to talk a hurricane out of making landfall. They were idiots. They saw a sick friend. Bakugo saw catastrophic betrayal. This wasn't just about the world. He didn't give a damn about the HPSC or the abstract concept of hero society. This was personal. This was about Deku. The useless, quirkless, crybaby Deku who had trailed after him his entire life, muttering in his stupid notebooks, dreaming a dream that should have been impossible. The Deku who had, against all odds, gotten a quirk, gotten into UA, and started to climb, his shadow growing longer and longer until it threatened to eclipse Bakugo's own. Their rivalry was the central, defining conflict of Bakugo's life. It was a vicious, teeth-gritting, explosive battle of wills that had forged him into who he was. He had learned humility from Deku. He had learned teamwork from Deku. He had even, in his own twisted way, learned to respect him. The nerd was his benchmark. His motivation. The immovable object to his unstoppable force. He was the other half of the equation that defined victory. And now, that damn nerd had decided to throw the whole equation into a black hole. He hadn't just turned his back on being a hero. He had declared the very concept of heroism invalid. He had taken their shared dream, the dream of standing at the top, of being the number one hero, a dream that Bakugo had pursued with singular, burning intensity, and he had spat on it. He had called it flawed, illogical, meaningless. That was the betrayal. It was a rejection of Bakugo's entire existence. When Ochako and the others returned from Dagoba Beach, their faces streaked with tears and etched with a new, hollowed-out despair, Bakugo didn't need to ask what happened. He could see their failure radiating off them like heat. He just scoffed, turned on his heel, and walked out. "Kaken, wait!" Ochako called after him, her voice thick with tears. "Don't call me that," he snarled over his shoulder, not breaking stride. "Go cry in a corner. I'm gonna go fix this. You can't fight him," Ida yelled, stepping forward. "His power, it's absolute. We saw it. He'll erase you." Bakugo stopped. He turned his head, his crimson eyes burning with a furious, incandescent light. "Then I'll just have to hit him so hard he forgets how to be a damn nihilist." "You tried talking. Now it's my turn." He didn't wait for an answer. He stormed out of the dorms, ignoring the shouts of his classmates and the lockdown alarms that blared half-heartedly in his wake. He was a force of nature in his own right, and he was on a collision course with another. Finding Deku wasn't a matter of detective work. It was a matter of understanding his rival's twisted psyche. Deku was on a crusade to dismantle symbols. The HPSC was the symbol of order. What was next? Bakugo chewed on the problem as he blasted his way across the city, a controlled explosion of purpose. What was the ultimate symbol of their shared world? The source of all this hope and chaos? It came to him in a flash of insight so obvious it made him grit his teeth. Yue High School. But Deku wouldn't make a frontal assault. Not yet. That was too crude for his new, detached persona. He'd be observing. Planning. And if there was one place the nerd would go to get a perfect view of Yue, a place steeped in their history, it was the rooftops of the Nabuya Municipal Building, the very place where Bakugo had been saved by Deku from the sludge villain, the place where All Might had appeared in a blast of heroic glory. It was a place of beginnings and failures, a perfect vantage point for a fallen angel to survey the paradise he was about to burn. Bakugo adjusted his trajectory, his gauntlets flaring. He was a human missile aimed at the heart of his oldest conflict. Izuku stood on the edge of the Nabuya Municipal Building's roof, the wind whipping his tattered cape around him. Below him, Yue was a floodlit island in a sea of darkness, its walls a fragile line drawn against the encroaching night. He was analyzing its defenses, its structural weaknesses, the emotional state of the occupants he could sense with his enhanced perception. It was the next logical target. The cradle of the heroic ideal. To unmake it would be to abort the next generation of the flaw before it could mature. His encounter with his friends had been a data anomaly. The emotional flare-up, the momentary breach in his logic, it was a sign that vestiges of his former self remained. These vestiges were a liability, a bug in his new operating system that needed to be patched. The emotional attachments are a vulnerability, the anti-monitor's silent hum affirmed in his mind. They must be purged to achieve maximum operational efficiency. He was contemplating the most efficient way to sever these remaining threads when a familiar sound cut through the night. The sharp, percussive boom of a controlled explosion. Izuku didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew that sound better than his own heartbeat. Or what used to be his own heartbeat. Deku. The voice was a low growl, sandpaper and gasoline. Bakugo landed on the rooftop behind him, his boots scraping against the gravel. There was no Midoriya, no nerd. Just Deku. The name that had once been an insult, then a symbol of hope, was now spoken like a curse. Kaken, Izuku replied, his voice flat. He turned slowly to face him. The sight of him sent a fresh wave of rage through Bakugo. The empty eyes, the calm posture, the tattered costume worn like a holy relic of a faith he'd abandoned. It was a complete and utter desecration. Cut the crap, Bakugo snarled, his palms already starting to smoke. I don't know what kind of black hole brain worm has gotten into you, and I don't care. We're gonna have a little chat. My fist's your face, you're gonna listen. Violence is the crudest form of communication, Izuku stated, his head tilting in that unnervingly analytical way. It is the language of the flawed system you seek to preserve. Oh yeah? Bakugo shot back, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Then I'm about to be real fluent. You think you're some kind of god now? That you get to decide the whole world is a mistake? You, who couldn't even pass a test without breaking your own arms? You're not a god, Deku. You're just a coward who couldn't handle the pressure. The insult, so personal and sharp, was designed to provoke. To crack the serene facade and find the insecure boy underneath. It didn't work. Izuku's expression remained unchanged. Your taunts are based on an obsolete version of my psychological profile. They are no longer effective. We'll see about that. Bakugo didn't wait for another word. He exploded. He didn't start with a test shot or a warning blast. He went straight for a full power, close-quarters assault, his movements a symphony of explosive fury. He knew Deku's fighting style intimately. He knew every feint, every dodge, every counter. He had spent his entire life studying it, consciously or not. He used his explosions not just for propulsion, but to create a chaotic, unpredictable storm of light and sound, designed to overwhelm Deku's senses. He feinted left, then blasted right, coming in low with a leg sweep powered by a small, precise detonation at his heel. Izuku simply took a half step back. The sweep passed harmlessly through the air where his ankles had been. He didn't use his antimatter aura. He didn't need to. His new perception allowed him to see the lines of force, the probability cones of Bakugo's attack. It was like watching a recording in slow motion. Your movements are inefficient, Izuku said, his voice calm amidst the explosions. You expend 30% more energy than necessary for this maneuver. The detached critique sent a fresh spike of fury through Bakugo. Shut up. He pressed the attack, a relentless barrage. He was a whirlwind of orange and black, his explosions echoing like cannon fire across the city. He wasn't just throwing punches. He was trying to force a reaction, to find a chink in the armor of Izuku's suffocating calm. He used his stun grenade technique, a blinding flash of light that would have incapacitated any normal opponent. Izuku didn't even blink. His pupils contracted slightly, but his gaze never left Bakugo. My optic nerves have been recalibrated to handle sudden shifts in luminosity, he stated, as if reading from a technical manual. Bakugo roared in frustration and unleashed an AP shot, a concentrated, armor-piercing blast. It was a direct, powerful hit, aimed at Izuku's chest. This time, Izuku raised a hand. The invisible field of unmaking materialized. The AP shot, a focused beam of pure destructive energy, hit the field and vanished without a sound, without a trace. Your quirk is a powerful but primitive tool, Izuku observed. A chaotic release of exothermic energy. It lacks finesse? I'll show you finesse! Bakugo screamed, his rage reaching a fever pitch. He knew he couldn't break through the erasure field with raw power. He had seen what happened to Endeavor, but he had something Endeavor didn't, a lifetime of data on his opponent. He changed his tactics. He stopped the direct assault and began to move, his explosions now used for pure, unmatched mobility. He became a blur, ricocheting off the rooftop structures, creating afterimages, attacking from a dozen angles at once. He wasn't trying to land a single, knockout blow. He was trying to overwhelm Izuku's processing speed, to create an attack so chaotic, so multifaceted, that the calm, analytical god wouldn't be able to keep up. He was forcing him to fight like the old Deku, and for a moment it worked. Izuku's placid expression tightened. The sheer, overwhelming volume of sensory input from Bakugo's assault forced him to rely on more than just passive analysis. Instinct, honed by years of battle, began to surface. He moved, dodging, weaving, his body remembering the dance of combat. He was forced to activate his antimatter aura more fully, the silent, invisible sphere expanding around him as Bakugo's explosions detonated closer and closer. That's it! Bakugo yelled, a triumphant, savage grin on his face. Fight me, you bastard! Stop hiding behind your little black hole party trick and fight me. He saw an opening. A split second where Izuku was repositioning after dodging a blast from above. Bakugo put everything into it. He angled his gauntlets down, unleashing a massive, sustained blast that launched him into the air, spinning like a top. He was building momentum, building power, gathering all his rage and frustration into a single, decisive point. You wanted to be the #1 hero. He screamed, his voice raw with the agony of their broken dream. You wanted to stand at the top and save everyone with a smile. You don't get to quit. You don't get to decide it's all meaningless just because it got hard. That's a coward's way out, and you were never a coward. He was directly above Izuku now, a meteor of pure, concentrated fury. Howitzer impact. He unleashed the full, unrestrained power of his ultimate move. It was not just an explosion. It was an inferno, a miniature sun detonating on the rooftop. The force of it was immense, a physical manifestation of Bakugo's entire being, his rage, his rivalry, his desperate, violent plea to his lost friend. The attack slammed into Izuku's defensive field, and for the first time, the field wavered. The sheer, overwhelming kinetic and thermal energy of the howitzer impact was too much for the passive aura to simply erase. It was like trying to drink a fire hose. The invisible sphere of antimatter flickered and, for a fraction of a second, shattered. The force of the explosion, no longer being unmade, slammed into Izuku. He was thrown back, skidding across the rooftop, his tattered costume smoking. The unbreakable calm on his face was shattered, replaced by a grunt of pain, of shock. He looked up, his eyes wide, and in that moment, the blackness in his eyes receded. Deep, vibrant, emerald green flared to life, burning through the void like a star being reborn. The placid, ancient god was gone, and in his place, for one terrifying, beautiful second, was Izuku Midoriya. His face was a mask of pure terror and confusion. He looked at his own hands, then at Bakugo, his expression screaming a single, silent question: what am I doing? Green lightning, the pure, untainted energy of One for All, crackled violently across his skin. It was a rebellion. A desperate, last-ditch prison break from the depths of his own soul. Now, the vestiges roared in unison within him, pouring every last ounce of their will into that single, glorious crack in the anti-monitor's control. Bakugo saw it. He saw the green light. He saw the terror on Deku's face. He saw his friend, trapped inside the monster. DKU! He roared, landing hard and blasting forward again, not wanting to give him a single second to recover. But the moment was fleeting. The anti-monitor was a fundamental force. It reasserted its control with the crushing, inexorable pressure of a dying star. The emotional response is a system error. Reasserting primary directive. Purging flaw. The silent logic slammed down like a guillotine. The green lightning was extinguished as if doused with water. The terror on Izuku's face vanished, smoothed over by the returning tide of cosmic serenity. The blackness flooded back into his eyes, deeper and more absolute than before. Izuku rose to his feet, dusting off his costume. He looked at Bakugo, who was charging at him again, his face a mask of desperate hope. A significant emotional response, Izuku noted, his voice once again a perfect monotone. Your methodology was surprisingly effective. I will add it to my data. However, the vulnerability has now been patched. He raised a hand. This time, he didn't create a barrier. He reached out towards Bakugo. Bakugo felt it before he saw it. A coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. The air around his gauntlets, primed for another blast, felt thick, dead. He tried to trigger an explosion, his muscles straining. Nothing happened. He looked down at his palms. The familiar, comforting scent of nitroglycerin was gone. The sweat glands in his palms, the source of his magnificent quirk, felt inert. What? He breathed, his charge faltering. Your quirk is a liability, Izuku said, his hand still outstretched. A thin, barely visible tendril of blackness was extending from his fingertips, touching the air around Bakugo's gauntlets. It promotes aggression and perpetuates the cycle of conflict. It is a flaw. I have turned it off. He hadn't erased it. Not permanently. The effect was temporary, a localized suppression field. But to Bakugo, it was the ultimate violation. He had been neutered, disarmed, rendered powerless by the very person he had once lorded his own power over. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, horrifying dread. He stared at Deku, at the calm, emotionless monster wearing his friend's face. He had gotten through. He had seen Izuku, and then he had watched him be dragged back under, deeper than before. He hadn't won. He had just made the monster stronger, more aware of its own weaknesses. Izuku lowered his hand. The suppression field vanished. Bakugo felt the familiar tingling in his palms return, but the will to fight was gone. Do not interfere again, Kaken, Izuku said, using the childhood name with a chilling lack of emotion. My mission is absolute. Your sentimental attachments are an obstacle I will be forced to remove permanently if you persist. He turned his back on his rival, the ultimate gesture of dismissal, and walked to the edge of the rooftop. Without looking back, he stepped off, falling into the darkness of the city below. Bakugo was left alone on the cratered, smoking rooftop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had thrown everything he had at the problem. He had poured his entire being into a single, explosive point, and he had failed. He had managed to crack the pillar, but the darkness within had only used the opportunity to seal the fissure with something stronger, colder, and more permanent. He sank to his knees, his body trembling not with exhaustion, but with a new, unfamiliar emotion. It was not rage. It was a cold, terrifying emptiness. It was despair.